The evening sky had turned a deep purple as Mrs. Thompson gathered her belongings from her corner office on the 23rd floor. As a corporate attorney at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, late nights were nothing new to her. She had just wrapped up a challenging merger deal, and the satisfaction of closing another successful negotiation put a slight smile on her face. The parking garage was nearly empty when she walked to her Range Rover, her heels clicking against the concrete. The day had been long, but productive. She was looking forward to getting home to her husband, maybe catching the last half of the movie they'd started the night before. The streets were quiet as she drove through the wealthy Oak Hills neighborhood. The massive houses set back from perfectly manicured lawns looked peaceful in the twilight. She'd taken this route home hundreds of times before, appreciating how the old-growth trees lined the winding roads. That's when she noticed the police cruiser that had been following her for the past few blocks. She checked her speed, 32 in a 35 zone. Her registration was current, lights all working. There was no reason for concern. Still, a familiar unease crept in as the cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life. She pulled over smoothly, positioning her car properly against the curb. Her hands remained visible on the steering wheel as she had learned to do years ago. Through her rearview mirror, she watched Officer P. Reynolds approach, his flashlight beam bouncing with each step. The instant he reached her window, before she could even speak, his tone made her stomach tighten. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The question came out sharp, accusatory. Not the standard license and registration, please, she'd expected. Mrs. Thompson kept her voice steady, professional, the same tone she used in high-stakes negotiations. "Good evening, officer. I'm on my way home from work. Was there a traffic violation?" The beam of his flashlight swept across her designer blazer, her leather briefcase on the passenger seat, lingering just a bit too long on her face. His expression shifted from suspicious to something harder to read. "You expect me to believe you live around here?" Officer Reynolds's voice dripped with skepticism. He hadn't even bothered to answer her question about the alleged violation. She reached slowly for her purse, maintaining a calm she didn't feel. "I'd be happy to provide my license and registration, officer." Inside, her mind was already cataloging every detail of this interaction, the way she would when preparing case notes. The luxury houses looming in the darkness around them seemed to be watching the scene unfold. This was her neighborhood. She had every right to be here. Yet something in Officer Reynolds's demeanor made it clear that he had already made certain assumptions that had nothing to do with traffic laws and everything to do with the color of her skin. What Officer Reynolds didn't know, as he stood there radiating unwarranted authority, was that Mrs. Thompson wasn't just any corporate attorney, and her husband, currently working late at the FBI field office downtown, wasn't just any federal agent. This routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. Mrs. Thompson kept her movements deliberate and measured as she reached for her documents, her law school training kicking in as she mentally documented every word, every gesture. She couldn't see the whole picture yet, but she knew this encounter was far from over. Sometimes the most powerful response wasn't an immediate reaction, but rather a carefully orchestrated series of events that would unfold with perfect timing. The night air grew heavier with tension as she prepared to hand over her credentials, knowing this was just the beginning of what would prove to be a pivotal evening, one that would ultimately spark changes far beyond this quiet suburban street. Officer Reynolds studied Mrs. Thompson's license and registration with exaggerated scrutiny, holding each document up to his flashlight beam as if searching for flaws. The address on her license matched the upscale neighborhood they were in, but this seemed to irritate him even more. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand resting deliberately on his belt. "I'd like to know the reason for this stop first, officer," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Years of courtroom experience had taught her how to maintain composure under pressure. "I said step out of the vehicle." His voice rose sharply, echoing off the manicured hedges of the nearby homes. A few porch lights flickered on in the distance, unseen neighbors curious about the commotion. Mrs. Thompson's mind raced through her options. As a lawyer, she knew her rights intimately. As a black woman, she knew the delicate balance required in these situations. Without taking her eyes off the rearview mirror, she discreetly pressed the record button on her phone, which was resting in the center console. Officer, I've provided my documentation as requested. I'm not legally required to exit my vehicle without probable cause. Could you please explain why I was pulled over? His response was immediate and hostile. You made an illegal turn back there, and your window tint looks suspicious. The excuses sounded hollow, even to him. The SUV's windows were factory standard, and she hadn't made any turns in the last mile. Which turn specifically? She pressed, her professional training taking over. And would you mind checking the window tint with your meter? I'd be happy to wait. Officer Reynolds's face hardened. He leaned closer to her window, his flashlight beam now deliberately aimed at her eyes. Listen here, I don't know how you got this address on your license, but something doesn't add up. People like you don't typically live in this neighborhood. The words hung in the air, their meaning unmistakable. Mrs. Thompson felt a familiar mix of anger and exhaustion wash over her. She'd encountered this type of prejudice before, but it never got easier. While maintaining eye contact with the officer, she slowly reached for her phone. Officer Reynolds, I want to be clear. I'm an attorney, and I live 3 blocks from here. Your current behavior is inappropriate and unprofessional. I'm going to contact my husband now. Put that phone down, he snapped, his hand moving to his weapon. That could be a weapon. I said exit the vehicle now. Mrs. Thompson's fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, sending her location and a brief message to her husband. She made sure to keep the phone visible and her movements slow and deliberate. Officer, I'm going to stay in my vehicle. I've done nothing wrong, and your behavior is being recorded. I suggest you check my credentials again. Her voice remained professional, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple traffic stop, and they both knew it. Other cars occasionally passed by, slowing down to observe the scene. The red and blue lights from the patrol car created an eerie dance of shadows across the perfectly maintained lawns. Officer Reynolds seemed to be wrestling with his next move. His authority was being challenged, but in a way that left him little room to maneuver. Mrs. Thompson's calm demeanor and obvious knowledge of her rights had thrown him off balance. Inside her car, Mrs. Thompson maintained her composed exterior while her mind worked through various scenarios. She knew help was already on the way, but these next few minutes would be crucial. Her phone continued recording as Officer Reynolds paced beside her vehicle, his agitation growing with each step. The air was thick with tension as nearby crickets chirped, oblivious to the drama unfolding on their quiet suburban street. What had started as a routine drive home had transformed into something far more significant, a moment that would soon become a catalyst for change in their community. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the tense silence. Officer Reynolds's head snapped up, his flashlight beam sweeping the street behind them. Mrs. Thompson allowed herself a small smile, knowing that the next phase of this encounter was about to begin. The tables were about to turn, but not in the way Officer Reynolds could possibly expect. Sometimes justice arrives not with a bang, but with the quiet approach of the right people at the right moment. The tension in the air shifted as Mrs. Thompson's fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, her heart beating steadily despite the pressure of the moment. The message to her husband was brief but clear. Being harassed by Officer Reynolds on Oak Hill Drive. Situation escalating. Recording now. Through her rearview mirror, she could see Officer Reynolds becoming increasingly agitated by her calm defiance. His flashlight beam darted erratically between her face and her phone, creating sharp shadows across the leather interior of her SUV. I told you to put that phone down, he barked, taking a more aggressive stance beside her window. You're interfering with a police investigation. Mrs. Thompson kept her voice level, years of courtroom experience evident in her measured response. Officer, I'm documenting this interaction for both our safety. I've complied with all lawful requests, but you still haven't stated a valid reason for this stop. The street remained quiet except for the occasional passing car, their headlights briefly illuminating the scene before moving on. Each passing vehicle seemed to heighten Officer Reynolds's agitation. His hand hadn't moved from his weapon since she'd reached for her phone. Last warning, he growled. Exit the vehicle now, or I'll have to remove you myself. Mrs. Thompson's phone continued recording as she responded. Officer Reynolds, I want to be very clear. I'm a legal resident of this neighborhood and a practicing attorney. Your current actions are being recorded and appear to be based on racial profiling rather than any legitimate law enforcement purpose." Her words hit their mark. Officer Reynolds's face contorted with a mix of anger and something else, perhaps the first flicker of uncertainty. He wasn't used to his targets being so well-versed in their rights or so composed under pressure. "You lawyers think you know everything," he spat out, "but out here, I'm the law. Now open this door before I break the window." Just then, Mrs. Thompson's phone vibrated with an incoming message. She didn't need to look at it to know what it said. Help was already on the way. Her husband's response would be swift and professional, exactly what this situation needed. The cool night air carried the sound of approaching vehicles, their engines purring quietly in the distance. Officer Reynolds noticed too, his head turning sharply toward the sound. His flashlight beam swept the street behind them, searching for the source. Mrs. Thompson maintained her composure, though a slight smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She knew what was coming. Years of marriage to a federal agent had taught her that justice sometimes arrived quietly, without fanfare or drama. "Officer," she said calmly, "I suggest you step back from my vehicle and wait for your backup to arrive." There was a subtle emphasis on the word "your" that made Officer Reynolds pause. The sound of car doors opening and closing echoed through the previously quiet street. Officer Reynolds's flashlight beam darted nervously between Mrs. Thompson and the approaching footsteps. The red and blue lights from his patrol car created an almost theatrical backdrop for what was about to unfold. In the darkness beyond Officer Reynolds's position, several figures emerged from unmarked vehicles. Their approach was purposeful but measured, professional training evident in every step. Mrs. Thompson could see the moment realization dawned on Officer Reynolds's face. These weren't the backup he'd been expecting. The night air, which had been heavy with tension and unspoken threats, suddenly charged with a different kind of energy. Officer Reynolds's authority was about to be challenged by a force he hadn't anticipated, and his body language showed he knew it. Mrs. Thompson's phone continued recording, capturing every moment of this turning point. Sometimes, she thought, the most satisfying response to injustice isn't a loud confrontation, but rather the quiet arrival of accountability. As the footsteps drew closer, Officer Reynolds's flashlight beam became increasingly unsteady. The tables were about to turn in a way he never could have predicted when he decided to pull over a black woman in an expensive car in this wealthy neighborhood. The next few moments would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice isn't outrage or anger, but rather the calm, methodical application of justice. And that justice was about to arrive wearing federal badges. Inside the FBI field office downtown, Mrs. Thompson's husband had just wrapped up a lengthy briefing when his phone buzzed. One glance at the message, and his entire demeanor shifted. His colleagues, seasoned agents themselves, noticed the change immediately. "We've got a situation," he said, his voice carrying the weight of both professional authority and personal concern. "Local officer harassing my wife on Oak Hill Drive. Anyone free to assist?" 3 agents who had been preparing to head home immediately stepped forward. They'd worked with him long enough to know he wouldn't ask without good reason. Within minutes, they were in 2 unmarked vehicles, heading toward the suburb with silent efficiency. During the drive, Mrs. Thompson's husband contacted the local police department's Internal Affairs Division. His voice remained steady as he explained the situation, years of federal service evident in his professional tone. "This is Special Agent Thompson with the FBI. I'm calling to report an ongoing incident involving one of your officers, P. Reynolds. He's currently engaged in what appears to be racial profiling and harassment of a civilian on Oak Hill Drive." The Internal Affairs Sergeant on the other end of the line took note of the FBI credentials and the seriousness of the accusation. "We'll send someone right away, Agent Thompson. Can you provide more details?" As they drove through the quiet suburban streets, Agent Thompson filled in the sergeant about the situation, including his wife's credentials and the fact that she was recording the interaction. The other agents in the car listened intently, their expressions hardening as they heard the details. "The target is displaying clear signs of racial bias," Agent Thompson continued. "My wife is a practicing attorney who lives in the neighborhood. The officer has refused to provide a legitimate reason for the stop and is escalating the situation unnecessarily." The streets were nearly empty as they approached Oak Hill Drive, allowing them to spot the police cruiser's flashing lights from several blocks away. Agent Thompson noticed several houses with their porch lights on, residents likely curious about the commotion in their usually peaceful neighborhood. As they got closer, they could see Officer Reynolds standing beside a Range Rover, his posture aggressive and threatening. The sight made Agent Thompson's jaw tighten, but his training kept him focused on the task at hand. They'd parked their vehicles strategically, one in front of the Range Rover, one behind the police cruiser. The 4 FBI agents emerged simultaneously, their movements coordinated through years of working together. Their badges gleamed in the mix of streetlights and police flashes. Agent Thompson took a moment to observe the scene fully before approaching. His wife sat calmly in the driver's seat, phone still recording. Officer Reynolds' hand hadn't left his weapon since their arrival. The situation was tense but controllable. In the distance, they could hear more sirens approaching, likely the Internal Affairs Unit responding to their call. Everything was falling into place, just as it should when law enforcement worked as intended. The cool night air carried the sound of cicadas and distant traffic, a peaceful backdrop to the tense scene unfolding on this suburban street. Agent Thompson knew the next few moments would be crucial, not just for this situation, but for the larger issue it represented. His team spread out naturally, taking positions that were both non-threatening and tactically sound. They'd handled countless high-pressure situations before, but this one was different. This wasn't just about law enforcement, it was about addressing a deeper, more persistent problem in their community. As they prepared to approach Officer Reynolds, Agent Thompson thought about how this moment could serve as a catalyst for change. Sometimes it took a personal encounter to expose systemic issues, and he intended to ensure this incident would lead to meaningful reform. The Internal Affairs Surgeon's words echoed in his mind. "We've had concerns about Officer Reynolds before, but nothing concrete enough to act on. Well, tonight would change that. Sometimes justice needed a little push from the right people at the right time." The stage was set for what would become a turning point in local law enforcement practices. As Agent Thompson took the first step toward Officer Reynolds, he knew this night would be remembered not for its conflict, but for its consequences. The night air grew thick with tension as Agent Thompson and his colleagues approached Officer Reynolds. Their footsteps were measured and deliberate, badges clearly visible in the flashing lights of the police cruiser. "Officer Reynolds," Agent Thompson called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority of years of federal service. "I'm Special Agent Thompson with the FBI. Please step away from the vehicle." The change in Officer Reynolds' demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from his face as he realized the situation had spiraled far beyond his control. His hand, which had been resting on his weapon, slowly dropped to his side. I was just conducting a routine traffic stop," he stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating into the cool night air. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly, casting unsteady shadows across the pavement. Agent Thompson's response was calm but firm. "There appears to be nothing routine about this stop, officer. We've already contacted your Internal Affairs Division. They're on their way." 2 other FBI agents positioned themselves strategically around the scene while the third stayed near their vehicles, coordinating with the approaching Internal Affairs Unit. The quiet residential street had become an impromptu stage for what was quickly turning into a lesson in accountability. Mrs. Thompson remained in her vehicle, her phone still recording as the scene unfolded. Her composed demeanor had never wavered, even as she watched her husband and his colleagues take control of the situation with professional precision. "Sir, I can explain," Officer Reynolds began, but Agent Thompson raised his hand, cutting him off. "Save your explanation for Internal Affairs," he said. "Right now, I need you to return to your vehicle and wait there." His tone left no room for argument. In the distance, more lights appeared as 2 Internal Affairs vehicles approached. The neighborhood had grown unusually quiet, as if the very street itself was holding its breath, watching justice unfold in real time. One of the FBI agents approached Mrs. Thompson's window. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The concern in his voice was genuine, professional yet human. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady. "I have the entire interaction recorded." She gestured to her phone, still capturing every moment of the encounter. Officer Reynolds watched from his patrol car as Internal Affairs officers arrived on the scene. His face showed a mix of emotions, fear, anger, and perhaps, finally, the first glimmer of understanding about the consequences of his actions. Agent Thompson conferred briefly with the internal affairs sergeants, his gestures measured and professional as he explained the situation. The night had grown cooler, but nobody seemed to notice the temperature. Mrs. Thompson finally stepped out of her vehicle, her movements graceful and controlled. She handed her phone to one of the internal affairs officers, the video evidence ready to be reviewed. Her presence commanded respect, not just as an attorney or the wife of an FBI agent, but as a citizen whose rights had been violated. The internal affairs sergeants listened intently as she recounted the events that led to this moment. Their expressions grew increasingly serious as they reviewed the footage on her phone. "This isn't the first complaint we've received about Officer Reynolds," one sergeant admitted quietly to Agent Thompson, "but it will definitely be the last." The neighborhood had grown active now, with lights on in several houses. A few residents watched from their windows or porches, witnessing a moment that would become a catalyst for change in their community. As the internal affairs team began their formal investigation, Agent Thompson stood beside his wife, their presence a silent testimony to the power of preparation, professionalism, and perseverance in the face of prejudice. The night that had begun with an act of discrimination was ending with a demonstration of justice. Sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't force or anger, but rather the calm, methodical application of law and order by those sworn to uphold it properly. Officer Reynolds sat in his patrol car, watching as his career unraveled through his own windshield. The red and blue lights that had once been a symbol of his authority now seemed to mock him, illuminating the consequences of his actions for all to see. The internal affairs investigation into Officer Reynolds unfolded like a carefully constructed puzzle over the following weeks. Mrs. Thompson's video evidence proved to be just the tip of the iceberg. In a dimly lit conference room at police headquarters, investigators pored over years of traffic stop data, body camera footage, and civilian complaints. The pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore. "Look at these numbers," one investigator said, spreading documents across the table. Over 80% of his discretionary stops involved minority drivers. The department average is nowhere near that. The investigation expanded beyond just traffic stops. Former complaints that had been dismissed or buried suddenly resurfaced, given new life by the weight of FBI involvement. Community members, emboldened by Mrs. Thompson's stand, began coming forward with their own stories. A young medical student described being stopped 3 times in 1 month. A retired teacher shared how Officer Reynolds had made her grandson lie face down on the pavement during a routine license plate check. A local business owner revealed dash cam footage of a similar incident from 6 months earlier. Agent Thompson and his FBI colleagues provided support to the internal affairs investigation, ensuring every lead was followed and every complaint was properly documented. The federal involvement sent a clear message that this case would not be swept under the rug. Mrs. Thompson, meanwhile, put her legal expertise to work. She compiled a comprehensive report analyzing the pattern of discriminatory practices, not just by Officer Reynolds, but within certain segments of the department itself. "It's not just about one officer," she explained during a meeting with police leadership. "This is about systemic issues that need to be addressed." Her voice carried the weight of both personal experience and professional authority. The police chief, a veteran officer who had prided himself on running a clean department, looked increasingly troubled as the evidence mounted. "I want every traffic stop from the past 3 years reviewed," he ordered. "Every complaint, every incident report. If there's a pattern, I want to know about it." Community leaders began organizing town hall meetings to discuss police reform. The quiet suburban streets that had witnessed Mrs. Thompson's encounter now hosted conversations about change and accountability. Local news media picked up the story, careful to protect the privacy of those involved while highlighting the broader implications. Headlines spoke of systemic review and department-wide changes. Inside the police department, changes were already taking place. New training programs were implemented. Supervisory protocols were strengthened. Officer Reynolds was placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation. The internal affairs sergeant who had first responded that night became a key ally in pushing for reform. "Sometimes it takes one clear case to expose larger problems," he noted during a departmental review. "We can't change the past, but we can ensure a better future. Mrs. Thompson and her husband found themselves at the center of a movement they hadn't planned to start. Their professional expertise, her in law, his in federal law enforcement, provided a unique perspective on how to implement meaningful change. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded beyond just one officer or one department. Other law enforcement agencies in the region began reviewing their own practices, eager to address potential issues before they faced similar scrutiny. The quiet suburban street where it all began had returned to normal, but the ripples of that night continued to spread. What had started as one officer's discriminatory actions had evolved into a catalyst for systematic reform. In the conference rooms and offices where decisions were made, Mrs. Thompson's recorded evidence played a crucial role. The calm professionalism she displayed that night, combined with her husband's measured response, provided a template for how to address discrimination effectively. As the investigation neared its conclusion, it became clear that this case would set precedents for how similar incidents would be handled in the future. Sometimes, real change starts with one person standing firm in the face of injustice, backed by those with the power to make that change permanent. The investigation was bringing to light not just individual actions, but a deeper need for structural reform. It wouldn't be a quick fix, but each revelation brought them closer to meaningful change. 6 months after that fateful night, the police department's conference room was packed with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and media representatives. The police chief stood at the podium, his expression somber as he delivered the investigation's findings. After a thorough review of Officer Reynolds's conduct and service record, the decision has been made to terminate his employment with immediate effect, the chief announced. His words echoed through the silent room. But this is just the beginning of our commitment to change. Mrs. Thompson sat in the front row beside her husband, both of them dressed in professional attire that spoke of their respective roles in law and federal law enforcement. Their presence served as a reminder of how a single incident had sparked a movement for reform. The chief continued, outlining the department's new initiatives. We're establishing a civilian oversight board with real power to review police conduct. We're implementing mandatory bias training, revising our traffic stop protocols, and creating a transparent complaint system. The oversight board was already taking shape. Community leaders, legal experts, and retired law enforcement officials had been carefully selected to ensure a balanced approach. Mrs. Thompson had been asked to serve as a special advisor, bringing both her legal expertise and personal experience to the role. After the press conference, the hallways buzzed with conversation as people discussed the changes. Local news reporters gathered sound bites, their cameras capturing what many saw as a turning point in community police relations. This isn't about punishment, Agent Thompson explained to a group of officers. It's about creating a department that truly serves and protects everyone equally. His words carried weight, coming from someone who understood both sides of law enforcement. The changes weren't just on paper. New patrol car cameras were installed with improved recording capabilities. Officers began wearing body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters. Regular community meetings were scheduled to maintain open dialogue between residents and police. In the months that followed, the impact became measurable. Traffic stop data showed more consistent treatment across all demographics. Civilian complaints decreased, while positive community interactions increased. The department began receiving inquiries from other cities looking to implement similar reforms. Mrs. Thompson's law firm established a pro bono program to help community members understand their rights during police encounters. Educational workshops were held in community centers, schools, and churches, teaching people how to handle difficult situations while staying safe. The suburban street where it all began had transformed into a symbol of positive change. Neighbors who had watched from their windows that night now actively participated in community policing initiatives. The police officers who patrolled the area knew they were being held to a higher standard. 1 year after the incident, the department's annual review showed promising results. Arrest rates had remained stable while use of force incidents had decreased significantly. The Civilian Oversight Board had reviewed dozens of cases, providing valuable feedback that improved police procedures. Real change takes time, Mrs. Thompson often reminded people during community meetings. But it starts with individuals willing to stand up and speak out, and institutions willing to listen and adapt. The case had become a model for other departments nationwide. Law enforcement agencies sent representatives to study the reforms, learning how to implement similar changes in their own communities. Agent Thompson and his FBI colleagues continued to support the initiative, providing resources and expertise when needed. The partnership between federal and local law enforcement have strengthened, creating more effective channels for addressing civil rights concerns. As the sun set on another day in their peaceful suburb, Mrs. Thompson and her husband often reflected on how one difficult encounter had led to such significant changes. Their professional lives had prepared them for that moment, but it was their commitment to justice that had turned it into a movement. The story wasn't over. Real change never is, but the foundation had been laid for a better relationship between law enforcement and the community they served. Sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't revenge or anger, but rather the patient, determined work of creating lasting change. Their experience had shown that when courage meets opportunity and when professionals use their expertise for the greater good, positive change isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The quiet street where it all began had become a reminder that justice, when properly pursued, can transform a community.